a judge and a Homeland Security agent. Powerful, respected, untouchable. Or so they thought. On the night of their wedding, a single phone call turned their celebration into a nightmare. Arrests, brutality, a system designed to silence them. But Rachel and Ethan Carter refused to bow. They fought back, exposing corruption and demanding justice. Would they win, or would the system crush them? Watch till the end to find out. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe now for more powerful stories. The evening was perfect. The sky burned in brilliant shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the backyard of an elegant home. String lights twinkled above, swaying gently in the evening breeze, their soft luminescence reflecting off the crystal glasses and perfectly arranged floral centerpieces. Laughter and music blended into a symphony of joy, a melody of love and celebration that filled the air. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, a night where love reigned supreme, where nothing else in the world mattered except the moment. Rachel Carter stood at the heart of it all, radiating beauty in her flowing ivory gown. The delicate lace of her sleeves caught the light as she moved, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders. Tonight wasn't just her wedding night. It was the culmination of years of love, patience, and unwavering commitment. She had spent her life fighting for justice, serving as a judge with the kind of fearless integrity that made her respected and, in some circles, feared. But here, surrounded by family and friends, she wasn't Judge Carter. She was simply Rachel, a woman deeply in love, basking in the happiest night of her life. Beside her, Ethan Carter was the picture of quiet strength. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, the crisp white of his shirt contrasting against his deep brown skin. A Homeland Security agent with a mind as sharp as his instincts, Ethan had spent years navigating high-stakes situations, defusing threats that most people never even knew existed. Yet tonight, there was no battle to fight, no mission to complete, just the warmth of his bride in his arms and the voices of those he loved filling the air around him. They swayed together under the soft glow of the lights, their first dance as husband and wife, unfolding in slow, intimate movements. Rachel looked up into Ethan's eyes, the world fading away with every step. He leaned down slightly, his forehead brushing against hers, as he whispered, "We made it." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "We did." Their guests surrounded them, watching with joyful eyes, clapping along with the rhythm of the music. Ethan's mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, overwhelmed with happiness. Rachel's father, a man who had built his entire life on discipline and order, stood with his arms crossed, a rare but undeniable look of pride on his face. Friends and family toasted to their future, glasses raised high as golden champagne bubbled over the rims. The air smelled of fresh roses and lilacs, the scent mingling with the rich aroma of gourmet dishes being served at the candlelit tables. A few yards away, children ran through the grass, their giggles floating on the evening breeze. Young Derek, Ethan's teenage nephew, chased after his little sister, his laughter echoing in the night. The joy was infectious, wrapping around every soul present, weaving an unspoken promise that this night would be remembered for a lifetime. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared in their happiness. Just a few houses down, behind a set of lace curtains that had yellowed with age, a pair of sharp eyes watched the scene with thinly veiled distaste. Eleanor Whitmore had lived in this neighborhood longer than most of its residents combined. A woman of old money and outdated ideals, she had always considered herself the self-appointed gatekeeper of propriety. "I know," he said, Disorting grobe the community, the professional sharp-eyed said. Ali of discipline, her eyes passing steadily over her profession. She had seen many things in her years, but what she saw now, a backyard filled with people she considered out of place, made her grip her teacup with quiet fury. Eleanor never liked changes. She never liked Rachel Carter, and certainly never liked the fact that she had moved in, bringing with her a different energy, a different culture, a different kind of power that Eleanor despised but could never quite articulate. And now, on this night, she saw it in full bloom. Laughter, music, celebration, all. Her fingers tightened around the phone before she even realized what she was doing. The number she dialed was one she had called many times before, the kind of number that always responded to voices like hers. Anyway, Dogwan. Anna, Dogwan, she said, her tone clipped and sharp. Loud music, suspicious activity. I don't feel safe. She paused, then added, It's an unusual crowd. I think something illegal might be happening. The words dripped from her lips like venom, deliberate and precise. And as she hung up the phone, a slow, satisfied smile crept onto her face. Back at the wedding, the world remained untouched by the malice brewing just a few houses away. Rachel had moved on to greet her guests, receiving warm hugs and whispered well wishes. Ethan stood near the bar, laughing with his brother-in-law, oblivious to the gears of fate turning in the distance. It wasn't until one of the younger guests, a boy no older than 14, paused mid-laugh, his face suddenly reflecting the flickering red and blue lights bouncing off the house, that the first thread of unease began to weave through the party. Hey, are those police cars? He muttered. Heads turned, conversation faltered. The laughter that had once filled the air thinned, replaced by murmurs of confusion. Glasses were lowered, backs straightened. Rachel, standing in the center of it all, felt the shift immediately. The energy had changed. She turned her head toward the driveway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of multiple police cars rolling to a stop, their doors opening in unison. A chill crept up her spine. Ethan, standing just a few feet away, caught sight of the same thing. His easy demeanor disappeared in an instant, his trained instincts kicking in. He stepped forward, his body language shifting from that of a groom enjoying his wedding night to that of an agent assessing a threat. Rachel met his gaze across the space between them, a silent conversation passing between them in an instant. Something was very, very wrong. The officers moved in like a wave, their postures rigid, hands resting on holsters. They scanned the scene, their eyes sweeping over the wedding guests with looks that weren't just professional. They were suspicious. Then, the voice of authority cut through the stunned silence. We received reports of a disturbance. Everyone needs to remain where they are. Rachel's heart pounded. She had spent years in courtrooms, delivering verdicts, upholding the law. She had seen officers speak with this exact tone before, right before something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. Ethan moved toward her, placing a steadying hand on her arm. His grip was firm, protective. Rachel inhaled deeply, gathering herself. She took a step forward, facing the officers with calm, measured authority. "Good evening, officers," she said, her voice smooth but commanding. "This is a private event. Our wedding, actually. There must be some misunderstanding." But as she looked into the eyes of the officer standing before her, she knew. This was no misunderstanding. Ethan's grip on Rachel's arm tightened just slightly, a silent warning, a quiet reassurance. He could read a situation before it even had a chance to escalate, and this one was already raising every red flag in his mind. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a badge that gleamed under the wedding lights, took a slow step forward, his hand resting on his utility belt. The way his eyes moved across the gathering, calculating, assessing, wasn't just routine protocol. It was the kind of gaze that belonged to a man who had already decided the people in front of him were guilty of something, even if he didn't yet know what. "We received reports of a disturbance," the officer said again, his tone clipped, impatient. "There's been a noise complaint and reports of suspicious activity." Rachel squared her shoulders, raising her chin slightly. "Suspicious?" she repeated. "This is a wedding, my wedding. I'd love to know exactly what you find suspicious about that." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, ignoring her question. "We'll need to take a look around." Ethan took a slow breath through his nose, forcing himself to remain calm. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself just a fraction in front of Rachel, not as a shield, but as a statement. "With all due respect, officer, that's not how this works," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "This is private property, and unless you have probable cause or a warrant, you have no legal right to enter." The officer's eyes flicked toward Ethan, as if he were only now deciding to take a closer look at him. "And you are?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Ethan Carter, Homeland Security." A brief pause. The officer's stance shifted, his expression tightening just slightly. But then he scoffed, shaking his head. "That's nice," he said dismissively. "But this isn't a federal matter. Right now you're just another civilian, and I'm telling you that we have a report that requires investigation." Rachel exhaled slowly, glancing at the growing number of officers stepping out of their vehicles. There were too many. This wasn't standard procedure for a noise complaint. This wasn't just about checking on a party. This was about something else entirely. The weight of understanding settled heavy in her chest. Her voice was measured, deliberate when she spoke again. "If you're responding to a noise complaint, then by all means, take a moment to listen." She gestured toward the reception area where music played softly, barely loud enough to carry beyond their property. "Does that sound excessive to you?" The officer's jaw twitched. He knew she was right, but he wasn't here to de-escalate. He was here to assert control. "We'll decide what's excessive," he said coolly. Then, with a nod to his fellow officers, he ordered, "Start checking IDs." The shift in the air was instant. The officers fanned out, moving through the gathering with an authority that didn't belong at a wedding. Guests stiffened, glancing at one another in confusion and unease. A murmur of protest rippled through the crowd as officers approached tables, asking people for their identification, as if they had stumbled into an active crime scene instead of a celebration. Rachel's mother, standing nearby, sucked in a sharp breath. "This is outrageous," she whispered under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief. Ethan could feel the tension building, could sense the way the guests were starting to shift, to bristle. A situation like this could go from bad to worse in an instant. He turned back to the lead officer, his expression dark. "You're overstepping," he warned. "This isn't procedure." The officer barely spared him a glance. "It is, tonight." Rachel clenched her teeth, stepping directly into the officer's line of sight. "This is harassment," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I know the law, and I know my rights. You have no cause for this level of scrutiny." The officer's eyes narrowed, and then something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of realization. of recognition. He knew exactly who she was. For the first time, a slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Judge Carter," he said, dragging out the words as if tasting them. "Well, isn't that something?" Rachel held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Yes," she said evenly. "It is." The smirk widened. "You know," he mused, "I've always wondered how someone like you made it to the bench." And there it was. The quiet venom, the thinly veiled bias. Rachel felt the words hit her like a slow burn beneath her skin, but she didn't react. She had spent her entire career dealing with men like this, men who thought their authority gave them the right to push limits, to rewrite the rules as they saw fit. But not tonight. "You have two choices," she said, her voice like steel. "You can do your job the right way, which means leaving unless you have an actual legal reason to be here, or you can keep digging yourself deeper into a lawsuit you will absolutely lose." For a long moment, the officer said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head as if barely restraining himself. "You like to talk," he muttered, "but you're still going to do as you're told." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but then suddenly a voice from behind them rang out. "Hey, get your hands off him." Heads turned. Across the yard, near one of the tables, two officers had a grip on Derek, Ethan's teenage nephew, who was standing stiff and wide-eyed between them. Ethan's entire body went rigid. Rachel's stomach dropped. "Well enough to help do you think you're doing?" Ethan barked, already moving toward them. One of the officers barely spared him a glance. "Standard search," he said dismissively. "Just making sure he's clean." "He's 16, Ethan snapped. "And you have no reason to search him." "Yeah?" the officer challenged, his grip on the boy tightening slightly. "How about resisting?" Derek was breathing fast, his eyes darting between Ethan and Rachel in confusion, his hands curled into anxious fists at his sides. Rachel knew that look. She had seen it on too many young men's faces in her courtroom. Fear, anger, helplessness. Ethan stepped in closer, his presence towering, voice low and edged with pure authority. "Let him go." The officers hesitated. Then, with a dismissive push, one of them shoved Derek backward. He stumbled slightly but quickly regained his footing, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. The silence that followed was thick. Rachel turned back to the lead officer, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. "This is over," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Now?" But the officer, Officer Mills, she now saw on his badge, only smiled. "No," he said simply. "It's just getting started." And as the first handcuffs clicked shut around someone's wrists, Rachel realized, with chilling certainty, that he was right. The metallic click of the handcuffs sent a ripple of shock through the wedding guests. Conversations died. The laughter and music that had filled the air only minutes ago now felt like echoes of a distant past. The mood had shifted. What had been a celebration of love had transformed into something unrecognizable. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound. One of Ethan's cousins, a young man in his mid-20s named Jordan, was being pulled away from the group, his hands forced behind his back as two officers cuffed him. "Who the hell is this?" Ethan's voice was sharp, a blade of controlled fury as he stepped forward. "Old Dane." "Or was refusing to comply," one of the officers said flatly, as if the words alone justified the act. Rachel's jaw tightened. Refusing to comply with what? She demanded, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of unease around them. You haven't given anyone a lawful order. You have no right to detain him. Officer Mills turned toward her, his smirk as smug as ever. We're just making sure everything's in order, Judge Carter, he said. It's a precaution. If your guests cooperate, there won't be any problems. Rachel felt her pulse pound in her ears. She had spent years in courtrooms watching power-hungry officers like this warp the law to suit their own ends. She had ruled against them. She had called them out. And now, standing in her own backyard, she was living through exactly the kind of overreach she had spent her life fighting against. Ethan was already moving. He strode toward Jordan, reaching for the cuffs. "Take 'em off," he ordered, his voice hard as steel. The officer holding Jordan stiffened. "Step back," he warned, fingers twitching toward his holster. Now. For a brief moment, Rachel thought Ethan might ignore the warning. She saw it in the way his muscles tensed, the way his jaw clenched so tight she could see the flicker of restraint warring with fury in his eyes. Ethan wasn't just any man. He was a trained agent, someone who had faced down threats far greater than some arrogant cops on a power trip. But here, now, there was no strategic maneuver that could make this situation anything other than what it was: an abuse of power, a provocation designed to escalate into something worse. Rachel moved quickly, placing a steadying hand on Ethan's arm. "Not like this," she murmured under her breath. Ethan exhaled through his nose, sharp and measured, before stepping back just enough to diffuse the immediate danger, but his gaze never left the officer's face. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice dangerously low. The officer smiled. "That's so." Rachel turned back to Officer Mills. "You've already overstepped your authority. If you keep pushing this, it will come back on you." Mills tilted his head, pretending to consider her words. Then he shrugged. "Or maybe," he said, "you're the one making this worse." And with a snap of his fingers, more officers began moving through the crowd. The unease that had been bubbling beneath the surface now burst into full-blown alarm. Wedding guests pulled out their phones, recording the scene as officers demanded identification, pushed people aside, and continued the wave of arbitrary detainments. Rachel's mother clutched her father's arm. "This is insane," she whispered. Rachel locked eyes with Hannah, her best friend and a civil rights attorney, who had been standing off to the side, quietly watching the situation unfold. Now, Hannah stepped forward, her legal instincts kicking in. "You need to release them," Hannah said, her voice crisp with authority. "Immediately. You have no probable cause, no warrant, and no reasonable suspicion. These are unlawful detentions." One of the officers turned to her with a lazy smirk. "You a lawyer or something?" "Yes," Hannah said coolly, "and I'm recording everything." The officer's smirk faltered just slightly, but Mills was unmoved. He folded his arms, looking amused. "That's nice," he said. "But last I checked, a law degree doesn't give you the right to interfere with police operations." "This isn't an operation," Hannah snapped. "It's harassment." Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain steady even as her heart pounded. "You're not investigating anything," she said to Mills. "You came here with one goal: to intimidate us. But you've miscalculated." Mills raised a brow. "That's so." Rachel nodded. "Because we're not just going to stand here and take it." The energy in the crowd shifted. Guests who had been paralyzed with uncertainty now straightened their backs. The tension that had once been laced with fear was turning into something else. Anger, defiance, resolve. A man near the back, a distant cousin of Ethan's, called out, "You're targeting us for no reason." Another guest added, "This is a wedding, not a crime scene." Mills's expression darkened. He took a slow step toward Rachel. "I don't think you understand how this works, Judge," he said, voice laced with mockery. "You might be used to sitting behind a bench, making decisions in a courtroom, but out here, we make the rules." Rachel didn't blink. "Not tonight, you don't." The defiance in her voice was like a spark in a dry field. Then, the next move came, and it changed everything. One of the officers reached for a young guest, a teenage boy who had done nothing but stand there, watching in wide-eyed fear. The officer grabbed his wrist, yanking him forward, and the boy stumbled, a yelp escaping his lips. That was the breaking point. "Let him go," someone shouted. Ethan moved instantly. Before the officer could react, Ethan was there, his grip closing around the man's wrist with the kind of speed and precision that came from years of training. He twisted, not enough to hurt, but enough to force the officer to release the boy. The officer reeled back, his face contorting with outrage. "You assaulted an officer?" he spat. Rachel saw the setup a split second before it happened. "Ethan," she started. Too late. The officers rushed him. Ethan barely had time to brace before they were on him. 4 officers swarmed, shoving him back, twisting his arms behind him. One slammed him down against the grass, knee pressing hard against his back. Rachel screamed. "Stop." She surged forward, but hands grabbed her. 2 officers yanking her back. "Stay where you are," one barked. Rachel fought. She twisted, her heels digging into the grass. "Get off of him. He didn't do anything." But they were already pulling Ethan to his feet, dragging him toward the police cars as he struggled. Mills turned to her, smug and victorious. "Guess he should have stayed in line." Rachel's blood boiled. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly hate. Then the cold, unforgiving click of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. And just like that, the night that was supposed to be the happiest of their lives had become a waking nightmare. Rachel's wrists burned against the cold metal of the handcuffs, but the pain barely registered. Her heart pounded with a wild, chaotic fury as she watched Ethan struggle against the officers holding him down. His face was tense, his jaw clenched as he kept himself from fighting back, but she could see the barely restrained rage in his eyes. They had trained him for situations like this, for moments where restraint meant survival. But that didn't make it any easier to watch. "Let him go," someone shouted. Ethan moved instantly. Before the officer could react, Ethan was there, his grip closing around the man's wrist with the kind of speed and precision that came from years of training. He twisted, not enough to hurt, but enough to force the officer to release the boy. The officer reeled back, his face contorting with outrage. "You assaulted an officer?" he spat. Rachel saw the setup a split second before it happened. "Ethan," she started. Too late. The officers rushed him. Ethan barely had time to brace before they were on him. 4 officers swarmed, shoving him back, twisting his arms behind him. One slammed him down against the grass, knee pressing hard against his back. Rachel screamed. "Stop." She surged forward, but hands grabbed her, 2 officers yanking her back. "Stay where you are," one barked. Rachel fought. She twisted, her heels digging into the grass. "Get off of him. He didn't do anything." But they were already pulling Ethan to his feet, dragging him toward the police cars as he struggled. Mills turned to her, smug and victorious. Guess he should have stayed in line. Rachel's blood boiled. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly hate. Then the cold, unforgiving click of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. And just like that, the night that was supposed to be the happiest of their lives had become a waking nightmare. Rachel's wrists burned against the cold metal of the handcuffs, but the pain barely registered. Her heart pounded with a wild, chaotic fury as she watched Ethan struggle against the officers holding him down. His face was tense, his jaw clenched as he kept himself from fighting back, but she could see the barely restrained rage in his eyes. They had trained him for situations like this, for moments where restraint meant survival. But that didn't make it any easier to watch. The officer's jaw tightened, but his hand twitched slightly at his side. He wasn't as sure anymore. Mills, however, wasn't about to let control slip away. "Do your damn job," he barked. The officer stiffened, then reached for Hannah. Rachel's mother let out a cry, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched her daughter, her son-in-law, and now their closest friend being treated like criminals. Guests murmured, their voices growing louder, angrier. Some of them started taking out their own phones, recording everything. Mills's smirk was gone now, replaced with frustration. He was losing control. Rachel could see it in the way his eyes darted toward the growing number of phones pointed in his direction. "You think your little videos are going to help you?" he sneered. "We control this narrative." Rachel let out a short, humorless laugh. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Mills took a slow step toward her. "You hear the one in cuffs, Judge Carter?" Rachel lifted her chin. For now. A murmur of protest rippled through the crowd as Ethan was shoved forward. The officers were moving him toward one of the squad cars. His brothers, tall, broad-shouldered men who had inherited their mother's fierce protectiveness, took a step forward instinctively. "Don't," Ethan called, his voice clear despite the tension. "They want an excuse." His brothers hesitated, their hands curling into fists at their sides, but they stayed put. Rachel felt something warm and proud swell in her chest. They were angry, furious, but they weren't going to play into Mill's hands. Still, the air crackled with the kind of energy that could snap at any moment. Mills turned back toward the crowd, taking a slow look at the people still standing in small clusters. Guests in formal attire, children clinging to their parents, elderly relatives sitting with their hands trembling in their laps. His lip curled in something like disgust. "You people never learn," he muttered under his breath. Rachel saw Ethan flinch. Not from pain, from recognition. Those were the words that had been spoken to him before. Not by Mills, but by men just like him. Men who thought their badge gave them the right to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. Something inside Ethan hardened. "You're done," he said, his voice quiet but deadly. "I promise you, you're done." Mills just laughed. Big words from a man about to spend the night in a holding cell. The officers reached for the door handle of the squad car. Then, "Stop!" The voice was loud, commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. Rachel turned. So did Mills. A new figure was approaching from the driveway, walking with the kind of authority that made everyone instinctively straighten their backs. Captain Ramirez. Rachel had only met him once, at a legal seminar about civil rights cases. He had been direct, no nonsense, and someone who, at least on the surface, hadn't seemed comfortable with the kind of police work Mills specialized in. And right now, he did not look happy. "What the hell is going on here?" Ramirez demanded, his eyes sweeping over the scene, at the guests, at the detained newlyweds, at the officers who had been treating this like a military operation. Mills stepped forward. "Captain, we received a report." "I don't care what report you received," Ramirez cut him off. "You want to explain why I have half the neighborhood calling the station, telling me my officers are crashing a wedding?" Mills hesitated. It was the first time all night Rachel had seen him falter. Ramirez turned his sharp gaze toward Rachel, then to Ethan. His eyes flicked down to the cuffs on their wrists. His expression darkened. "Uncuff 'em," he ordered. Mills's jaw clenched. "Sir." A long beat of silence. Then Mills, seething but powerless against a direct order, jerked his chin toward one of the officers holding Rachel. "Do it." Rachel let out a slow breath as she felt the cold metal loosen around her wrists. She didn't rub them, didn't show any sign of relief. Not yet. Across from her, Ethan was freed as well, rolling his shoulders before fixing Mills with a look that promised this wasn't over. Ramirez turned to the remaining officers. "Release the guests, right now, unless you have an actual reason for detainment." The officers hesitated. Then, one by one, the cuffs came off. Mills's face was red with barely contained rage. Rachel could almost hear his teeth grinding together. "You just made a big mistake," he muttered. Rachel met his glare head on. "You did," she corrected. And for the first time all night, Mills had nothing to say. Ramirez exhaled through his nose, pinching the bridge of it as if trying to control his frustration. "I want a full report on my desk first thing in the morning," he told Mills. "And you better pray to God that I like what I read." Then he turned back to Rachel and Ethan. "I'll be in touch," he said simply. Rachel nodded. "So will we." Ramirez didn't argue. And just like that, the officers began to disperse. Their control shattered. The damage, however, had already been done. And Rachel knew this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The handcuffs were off, but the damage had already been done. Rachel rubbed her wrists absent-mindedly, barely registering the sting where the metal had bitten into her skin. Around her, guests were still shaken, whispering to each other in hushed, disbelieving tones. Some hugged their loved ones. Others stood frozen, trying to process how a night meant to celebrate love had turned into a scene of chaos and fear. Ethan, standing beside her, rolled his shoulders, his sharp gaze locked onto Officer Mills, who still radiated defiance despite having just been publicly overruled. His face was red with barely contained fury, but it was the kind of anger born from humiliation, not remorse. Rachel had seen that expression in courtrooms before, on men who had lost their grip on power, who had underestimated their opponent, who had thought themselves untouchable until the moment reality hit them square in the jaw. "Are you all right?" Ethan's voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the rough edge underneath, the remnants of barely restrained fury. Rachel nodded, but her eyes were still locked on Mills. "I'm fine," she murmured. "But this isn't over." It was the truth. The officers may have been forced to retreat, but they weren't gone. Not really. The tension in the air hadn't dissolved. It had simply shifted, rearranged itself into something else, something colder, more calculating. Hannah stepped up beside them, still clutching her phone. "I've got everything," she whispered. "Every unlawful detainment, Every second of excessive force. They'll never be able to spin this in their favor. Rachel exhaled, steadying herself. Good, because I intend to make sure they answer for it. Ethan's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Across the yard, Captain Ramirez was issuing orders, his face set in a grim scowl. Officers were retreating, some more reluctantly than others. But one thing was clear. Whatever power Mills thought he had wielded over this night had crumbled. And yet he wasn't done. Rachel saw it the moment his lips curled into a smirk. "You really think this is over?" Mills' voice carried just enough for them to hear, but not enough to be outright confrontational. It was a private warning. Ethan turned toward him slowly, his expression unreadable. "I think you've already lost more than you realize," he said coolly. Mills scoffed, shaking his head. "You got lucky," he muttered, then glanced at Rachel. "Both of you." Rachel didn't flinch. "You're going to regret tonight," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "Not just because of what you did, but because of who you did it to." Mills tilted his head, his smirk widening. "You really believe that, don't you?" Rachel's gaze didn't waver. "I don't believe it," she said. "I know it." For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, something that looked dangerously close to doubt. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Enjoy the rest of your wedding," Mills said mockingly, before turning on his heel. Ethan's fingers curled into fists at his sides, but Rachel reached out, touching his arm lightly. "Not now. Not yet." Mills walked away, his posture stiff, his shoulders tight with the weight of everything he had lost tonight. Rachel watched him go, and for the first time in her life, she felt something close to satisfaction at the idea that someone had made an enemy of her. Because this time, she was going to win. The guests stayed longer than expected, unwilling to leave just yet, as if parting ways too soon would let the night's horrors settle in fully. But eventually, one by one, people trickled out, offering hugs and murmured promises of support. By the time Rachel and Ethan were alone in the house, exhaustion weighed on them both. The wedding dress that had once made Rachel feel like a queen now felt heavy on her skin, a reminder of a night that had shifted from fairy tale to battle. She stood by the window, staring out at the yard, where only a few flickering lights remained. The grass was still trampled in places where officers had dragged people away. It felt. Ethan walked up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You should get some sleep." Rachel let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Sleep?" she echoed. "After that?" His grip tightened slightly, grounding her. "We need to be sharp for what comes next." She turned to face him. His eyes were steady, but she knew him well enough to see the storm raging beneath. "Ethan," she said softly, "what happened tonight?" He exhaled sharply, his expression hardening. "Wasn't an accident." Rachel nodded. "It was personal." He didn't argue. He knew it, too. Rachel swallowed, her mind racing. This wasn't just a power trip," she murmured. "It was a warning." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then they should have made sure we were the kind of people who take warnings." Her lips curled slightly at that, but the weight in her chest remained. "We need to move fast," she said, "before they can control the narrative." Ethan nodded. "We will," but even as he said it, Rachel knew they were about to step into something bigger than just one night of police overreach. This wasn't just about Mills. It wasn't just about them. It was about all of it. The system, the abuse of power, the way people like Mills operated under the assumption that no one would ever hold them accountable. Rachel wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. Not ever again. Rachel barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the night played over and over in her mind, every second of it etched into her memory like a scar that refused to fade. The cold steel of the handcuffs, the weight of the officer's hands on her, the way Ethan had been shoved to the ground like a criminal. And then there was Mills, his smug, untouchable arrogance, the way he had smiled as if he knew he would get away with it all. Not this time. She sat up, her body still tense with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Beside her, Ethan stirred, but didn't open his eyes. He had fallen asleep later than she had, only after ensuring that every piece of video footage from the wedding guests had been backed up in multiple locations. Even in sleep, his breathing was slow, controlled, the kind of unconscious discipline that came from years of training. But Rachel knew he was just as restless as she was. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, crossing the room to grab her phone. The screen was already flooded with notifications, texts, missed calls, voicemails. The world had woken up, and it had seen everything. Her inbox was full of messages from journalists, attorneys, civil rights advocates, and even people she barely remembered meeting. "I saw the footage. Let me know how I can help. This is going to explode. Are you ready for it? We need to talk. I can get this in front of a judge by morning." She had expected the response to be strong, but this was a tidal wave. The videos had gone viral overnight, picked up by news stations and spread across social media like wildfire. People weren't just talking about what had happened, they were outraged. The officer's behavior, Mills' smug dismissal of the law, the sheer force used against an innocent wedding party, it had struck a nerve. And now the pressure was mounting. Rachel took a deep breath, scrolling through the footage again. The shaky angles, the panicked voices in the background, the undeniable aggression of the officers. There was no spinning this, no excusing it, no brushing it under the rug. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "How bad is it?" She turned. He was sitting up now, rubbing his face before reaching for his own phone. The moment he saw the screen, his expression hardened. "Oh," he muttered. "That bad?" "Worse," Rachel murmured, handing him her phone. "This is national now." Ethan exhaled through his nose, scanning the headlines. Judge and Homeland Security agent targeted at their own wedding. Racial profiling or abuse of power. When the protectors become the threat. The night justice was put in handcuffs. He tossed the phone onto the nightstand, running a hand over his head. "They'll be panicking," he said. "The department, the mayor, Ramirez, everyone." Rachel nodded. "Which means Mills is either going to double down, or they're going to throw him to the wolves." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They won't let this touch them if they can help it." She sat beside him, eyes sharp. "That's exactly what we need to stop from happening." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, something flickered in his eyes. Something deeper than anger, admiration, respect. And maybe, beneath all of it, the smallest glimmer of pride. "You're going to make them regret ever touching us," he murmured. Rachel's lips curled. "Damn right I am." By noon, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The mayor had been forced to issue a statement promising a thorough internal review of the incident. Ramirez, who had tried to maintain a neutral stance the night before, was now scrambling to control the narrative. And Mills? He was nowhere to be found. The police union was already trying to shift the blame, releasing carefully worded statements about how officers had been responding to a potentially volatile situation, and that their actions were within department protocol. But the public wasn't buying it. Every second of the footage contradicted them, and people were demanding accountability. Rachel and Ethan sat in their lawyer's office, watching the chaos unfold on a massive screen as the news played back the footage on a loop. Hannah sat across from them, scrolling through the latest developments. "The DA's office just confirmed they're reviewing the footage," she said. "That's good." "It's not enough," Ethan muttered. Hannah glanced up at him. "It will be," she assured him. "Once we're done." Rachel leaned forward. "We need to be strategic. If we let this get away from us, they'll twist it, bury it, or make it about something else. We can't let them dictate the terms." "They won't," Hannah said, "because we're going on offense." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" Hannah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Press conference. Public demand for accountability. Civil rights lawsuit. And, if we play this right, criminal charges against Mills and any officer who was part of this." Rachel exhaled. "That's a lot." Hannah shrugged. "They escalated first." Ethan's expression darkened. "And they think they can get away with it." Hannah leaned back, crossing her arms. "Then let's make sure they don't." The press conference was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters murmured, their pens and microphones ready. The energy in the air was electric, tense, waiting for something to snap. Rachel stepped up to the podium. She had spent years delivering verdicts, issuing rulings, holding people accountable. But this was different. This wasn't about legal precedent or courtroom decorum. This was about justice. This was about standing up against a system that had tried to silence her in the most humiliating, violent way possible. She let the silence settle before she spoke. "My name is Judge Rachel Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Last night, my husband and I were celebrating our wedding with our family and closest friends. What should have been the happiest night of our lives turned into a nightmare when police officers, without cause, without a warrant, and without justification, stormed our home, harassed our guests, used unlawful force, and arrested innocent people." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Rachel's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I have spent my career upholding the law. I have spent years believing in a system that is supposed to protect the people it serves. But last night, I saw firsthand what happens when those entrusted with power abuse it. When the people who are supposed to serve justice break it." Her voice sharpened. "And I will not let that stand." She stepped aside, and Ethan took the microphone. "I've worked in law enforcement for years," he said, his voice measured but powerful. "I know what professionalism looks like. I know what restraint, discipline, and integrity are supposed to be. What happened last night was none of those things." His jaw tightened. "This wasn't about a noise complaint. This wasn't about protocol. This was about power. And it was about the people who think they can abuse it without consequences." His eyes flicked toward the cameras. "To Officer Darren Mills, and every officer who followed his lead, you made a mistake. You targeted the wrong people. And now, you're going to answer for it." The press exploded with questions. Rachel didn't answer them. She didn't need to. They had made their move. And now, the fight was just beginning. The fallout was immediate. The moment Rachel and Ethan stepped away from the podium, the press conference footage spread like wildfire. News outlets ran with the story, legal analysts dissected every word they had spoken, and social media erupted with outrage. Hashtags like "Justice for the Carters" and "End Police Abuse" trended worldwide. Within hours, their phones were flooded with messages. Some from allies offering support, others from strangers who had faced similar injustices and saw Rachel and Ethan as the voices they had never been given. But among the flood of solidarity, there were threats too. Some subtle, others not. Anonymous emails, blocked calls, warnings that they were making enemies in the wrong places. Rachel barely reacted to them. She had spent too many years staring down threats in the courtroom to be intimidated by cowards hiding behind screens. But Ethan? He was a different story. Sitting at the dining table, scrolling through yet another wave of messages, he exhaled sharply and tossed his phone onto the surface with more force than necessary. "They're already trying to paint us as radicals," he muttered. "Saying we're anti-police, that this is some political stunt." Rachel didn't look up from the legal documents spread out in front of her. "Of course they are," she said, flipping a page. "They can't argue with the evidence, so they'll attack the people exposing it." Ethan ran a hand over his face, his frustration barely contained. "They're trying to control the narrative." "And they're failing," Hannah added from across the table. She was sipping her coffee, looking unbothered as she scanned a legal draft on her laptop. "Every time they push back, the public response doubles down. You should see the amount of people demanding action. We're talking protests, federal oversight petitions. Hell, even the mayor is scrambling to distance himself from Mills." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "That won't last. The second this blows over, they'll try to sweep it under the rug." Rachel set down her pen, finally meeting his gaze. "Then we don't let them." Hannah grinned. "That's the spirit?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What's our next move?" Rachel exhaled. "We go legal." Hannah nodded. "Already in motion. The civil rights lawsuit is being drafted, and I'm pushing for the DA's office to file criminal charges against Mills and the officers involved. Public pressure is helping." "There's no way they can ignore this now." Rachel's jaw tightened. "We can't just stop at Mills. We need a full investigation into the department. Every officer who enabled this. Every superior who let him get away with it for years." Ethan crossed his arms. "That's a bigger fight." "It's the right fight," Rachel countered. Hannah smirked. "God, I love you both when you're like this." Rachel rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. "This is Rachel Carter." The voice on the other end was low, cautious. "Judge Carter, this is Captain Ramirez." Rachel exchanged a look with Ethan before putting the call on speaker. "Captain," she said evenly, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "You made quite a mess," Ramirez said, though there was no real heat in his tone. "City Hall is in full-blown crisis mode. The mayor is demanding answers. The police chief is under pressure to act." "Good," Rachel said. "That means it's working." Ramirez sighed. Listen, I don't like Mills any more than you do. He's reckless, arrogant, and thinks he's untouchable. But you're painting a target on your backs." Ethan spoke up. "We're not the ones who started this." "Oh," Ramirez admitted. but you're making powerful people nervous. And people like Mills, when they're cornered, they get desperate." Rachel's fingers tightened around the phone. "Is that a warning, Captain?" "It's a reality check," Ramirez said. "I have a feeling Mills isn't going to go down quietly. If you push too hard, he'll push back." Rachel's blood ran cold. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew Ramirez was right. Mills was too arrogant, too entitled to let this go without a fight. He wasn't the type to admit defeat. He was the type to retaliate. Rachel took a slow breath. "Thank you for the call, Captain." Ramirez hesitated. "For what it's worth, I hope you win." The call ended. Silence settled over the table. Hannah was the first to break it. That wasn't ominous at all. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but Rachel could see the tension in his shoulders. "We need to be careful," he said. Richard nodded. "We will be." But deep down, she knew this was far from over. It was only just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, every eye locked onto the front of the room where Rachel and Ethan sat side by side, their hands resting on the polished wooden table. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken weight pressing down on everyone inside. This wasn't just another trial. This wasn't just about them. This was about justice. The judge, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense expression, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "We are here today to determine the legitimacy of the claims brought against Officer Darren Mills and several other members of the police force regarding unlawful detainment, excessive force, and civil rights violations. The prosecution may proceed." Rachel inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had spent years in courtrooms, delivering verdicts, overseeing trials, but now she was on the other side. She wasn't the judge today. She was the plaintiff, and she would not lose. Hannah stood, her presence commanding as she approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong, "this case is about power. Who wields it, who abuses it, and who must be held accountable when they do. The evidence we will present will show that on the night of Rachel and Ethan Carter's wedding, the defendants, under the leadership of Officer Darren Mills, engaged in behavior that was not only unethical, but illegal. They violated the rights of innocent civilians, used force where none was warranted, and operated under the assumption that their badges made them untouchable. Today, we prove them wrong." Mills, sitting at the defense table, scoffed. Rachel caught the motion out of the corner of her eye but didn't react. He wanted her to look at him. He wanted her to flinch. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The prosecution began presenting the evidence. One by one, the videos played, each frame capturing the chaos of that night in brutal clarity. The way the officers had stormed into their wedding uninvited, the way guests had been thrown to the ground, handcuffed, humiliated, the way Mills had smirked as he arrested Rachel and Ethan like they were criminals instead of victims. The jury watched in silence. Then came the witness testimonies. Rachel's mother took the stand first. Her voice trembled as she recounted the horror of watching her daughter, manhandled, her son-in-law treated like a threat. "I have never in my life been more afraid," she whispered. "They treated us like we were nothing." Then Ethan's brother, who had tried to intervene and had been shoved back. Then Derek, the teenage boy who had been searched without cause, his hand shaking as he recalled the fear of that moment. And then, finally, Rachel herself. She walked to the stand, her back straight, her hands steady as she took the oath, When she sat down, she met the jury's eyes without hesitation. "Judge Carter," Hannah began, using the title deliberately, "can you describe the events of that night from your perspective?" Rachel took a breath, then spoke. "It was supposed to be the happiest night of my life," she said. "A celebration, a gathering of family and friends. And then, without warning, without cause, police officers entered my home, my property, and treated us as if we were criminals. They didn't ask questions. They didn't de-escalate. They came in looking for a fight." She turned slightly, letting her gaze settle on Mills, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "And they found one." Hannah nodded. "And at any point, did you or your guests pose a threat?" Rachel shook her head. "No. We complied. We explained. We asked for legal justification, and we were ignored. What happened when you identified yourself as a judge?" Rachel let out a short, humorless laugh. "They mocked me," she said. "Told me my title meant nothing out there, that they made the rules." Silence hung in the room. Hannah turned to the jury. "I want you all to consider that," she said. "A judge. Someone whose entire career is built on upholding the law was denied her rights. If this can happen to her, to her husband, a federal agent, imagine what happens to those without the resources to fight back." She let that settle before turning back to Rachel. "And what happened when your husband attempted to defend a young boy who was being unlawfully searched?" Rachel's throat tightened, but she kept her voice even. "They attacked him. They threw him to the ground, put him in cuffs. I saw the man I love, who has spent his life defending this country, pinned beneath officers who were supposed to serve and protect, her hands curled into fists in her lap. And then they arrested me, too." More silence. Then Hannah stepped closer. "And what do you want to see happen today, Judge Carter?" Rachel's answer was immediate. "Justice." Hannah nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney, a man Rachel had gone up against before, understood and approached. He was smooth, practiced. His job wasn't to prove Mills was innocent. It was to cast just enough doubt that the jury hesitated. "Judge Carter," he said, "is it fair to say that tensions were already high that night?" Rachel didn't blink. "No, not until the officers arrived." The attorney clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slightly. But there was a noise complaint." "A fabricated one," Rachel countered. "We were well within city ordinance. But how were the officers supposed to know that before arriving?" Rachel tilted her head slightly. "By doing their jobs correctly," she said. A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. The attorney tried again. "You're a judge. You know officers have discretion in situations like these. Discretion is not a free pass to violate rights," Rachel said coolly. "And yet," the attorney pressed, "you and your husband resisted arrest." Rachel let out a slow breath. "We asserted our rights," she corrected. "The officers escalated." The attorney hesitated, just for a second. That was all Rachel needed. "And tell me," she continued before he could cut in, "if someone who has sat on the bench for years, who understands the law inside and out, can't even get officers to respect due process, what do you think happens to everyone else?" More murmurs. The defense attorney's lips thinned. He knew he was losing. Rachel just sat back and waited. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, Their verdict was clear. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. The moment the ruling was announced, the courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others let out sighs of relief. Mills sat stiffly, his jaw locked, his face pale. He knew what this meant. His career was over. Rachel felt Ethan's hand slip into hers, squeezing gently. She turned to him, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. They had won. But this wasn't just their victory. It was a message to every officer who thought their badge made them untouchable. To every person who had suffered under unchecked authority. To the system that had allowed people like Mills to thrive. Justice had been served, and it was only the beginning. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. It wasn't just a tale of injustice. It was a reflection of the reality many people face every day. Power, when left unchecked, can be dangerous. But courage, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of justice will always be stronger. The lesson here is clear. Never be silent in the face of wrongdoing. Never assume that those in power will always do what is right. And never let fear stop you from standing up for yourself and for others. Rachel and Ethan fought not just for themselves, but for the countless people who never got their day in court. Their story is a reminder that accountability is not optional, it is necessary for a just society. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you believe in stories that challenge the status quo and shine a light on truth, make sure to subscribe to our channel. More stories are coming, and you won't want to miss them. Justice is not given. It is fought for. Let's keep fighting together. See you in the next video.